anywhere in history that was not both a Christian one and was motivated specifically by Christians. Why? Because they said, we see the fact that we're all created in the image of God. And in fact, one of the first abolitionist movements was in the 4th century by the Cappadocian Fathers. And what they did is, I think it was Gregory Nazianzus, preaches this sermon where he says, how dare you think you can pay a price for God's image? There's a great book by a guy named Glenn Scrivener, who we're actually bringing over. He lives in the UK. He runs an organization called Speak Life. And we're bringing him over in November to speak at a conference we're running in Ontario. And he wrote a book called The Air We Breathe. And he goes through a number of these things historically where he talks about how Christianity is actually it's the progenitor of a lot of these things that we just assume within modern society. And one of the things he highlights is consent. Consent is a Christian ethic in the sense of, if you look at ancient cultures, whether that's
sexual consent?
Yeah. Okay. The idea that this should be consensual. Like I mentioned before,
right.
The whole idea of there not being a natural way to say a male virgin, but 25 ways to say a female prostitute. Like that was the Roman ideal. And that was just normative, and it was seen as just the neutral position. Whereas Christianity always looked at that and saying, like, those women have value and purpose and meaning. They bear the image of God. And so they need to be both protected and valued and seen as equals.
What about Judaism, which wasn't, the Holy Roman Empire? They had their own sect as well.
Yeah, I think this ethic sits at the heart of what Judaism should be, but things definitely go awry. We don't always do this well. And that's what Jesus, a lot of the time, criticizes, is the Sermon on the Mount in Matthew chapter 5. A lot of it is about this, where he says, you have heard it said, but I say. And so he looks at the law, and it sounds like he's correcting the law, but that's not what he's doing. He's actually going back to the intention of what the law meant. So when he says, you have heard it said, do not kill your brother, but I tell you, anybody who has hatred in his heart for his brother has committed murder. He's not saying that, if you hate your friend, that you're actually committing murder, but he's getting to the heart of the issue of what the law actually meant. Like the purpose of the intention of these things communicate ethics and values before they actually communicate prescriptions of how things should actually be. And part of the problem was that you had these sects, S-E-C-T-S, not S-E-X, right. That I mentioned before, like the Pharisees and the Sadducees, who were hyper-religious. And Jesus looks at them and he says, hey, you're tithing your mint leaves. That's stupid. That's missing the point of what tithing is about. Like stop going so into the specifics of the law where you're actually missing the forest for the trees. And part of that, I think, is this development which we see within Judaism, which is a negative patriarchal aspect. I don't think that patriarchy is necessarily a bad thing in and of itself, but there's a negative aspect of patriarchy in the same way that if you look at the content of Christianity and you pour it out, you get things like love your neighbor as yourself, yes. Pray for those who persecute you. But Christianity has a long history of not doing that well. There's another great book by a guy named John Dickson, who is an Australian New Testament scholar. He wrote a book called Bullies and Saints. And he goes through a lot of these examples of where he points out, okay, things like public education, that was a Christian institution. Things like universities, Christian institution. Public healthcare, Christian institutions. But then he says, Jesus says, make sure you take the log out of your eye before you start pointing at the speck in your brother's eye. Let's look at the logs in our eye. Let's look at some of these examples of where Christianity has really done a terrible job at articulating and living by its essence.
When you say those are Christian institutions, is it literally they're started by Christians on the basis of their Christian faith, or they're started by people who happen to be Christians and therefore they're Christian institutions? You understand what I'm saying?
Yeah. Well, if you look at their motivations for why they're doing what they're doing, a lot of it has to do with, like, the education factor was we want people to be able to read the Bible. Like, a lot of the origins of public education come out of individuals like John Knox in Scotland, who was like, hey, I'm a Protestant. We're translating the Bible into English. I want people to know what it is. And the interesting thing I mentioned to you earlier before the show, Tom Holland, the historian, not the actor
Not
who
the
is
actor.
Spider-Man, always have to preface with that, in his book Dominion, has a big section on slavery and says there is no abolition movement anywhere in history that was not both a Christian one and was motivated specifically by Christians. Why? Because they said, we see the fact that we're all created in the image of God. And in fact, one of the first abolitionist movements was in the 4th century by the Cappadocian Fathers. And what they did is, I think it was Gregory Nazianzus, preaches this sermon where he says, how dare you think you can pay a price for God's image? You can't do that because there is no there is no price that could actually pay for how valuable the image of God is in every individual. And so they're the first ancient abolitionist movements. And then you also have Augustine, who's raiding these slave ships. Him and his church members are going in and raiding the slave ships and releasing them. And he writes and he says, I don't know if this is right to do, like ethically go in and like literally clear out these slave ships because this is to detriment of these people who this is their job. But at the same time, I can't help but do this.
Yeah.
And so you have these institutions which are not just motivated, but even the abolitionist movement in both England and then later in the United States, they were all Christians. None of them were not Christians. And even when the abolitionists, and there's a great section in Tom Holland's Dominion where he talks about how a number of the British abolitionists went down into North Africa to try to convince some of the sultans within North Africa to get on board, and they laughed at them. They laughed at them, and actually one of the lines, I think it was in Libya, the Sultan of Libya, said the only institution that goes back to Adam is slavery. In that it's like as inherent as it is for humanity to be humanity, slavery has also come alongside it.
Mm.
And I mean, slavery, there's still slavery going on in a lot of the Muslim world. But the word slave comes from the fact that North African Muslims were selling the Slavs from Europe into slavery. White slaves was literally where we get the word slave from.
Yeah.
It's the Slavics. So a number of these institutions that both Tom Holland, who's not a Christian, and Glenn Scrivener, who is a Christian, write about in Dominion and the Air We Breathe, point out very both articulately but pretty exhaustively, certainly Tom Holland's book is exhaustive, where a lot of these things that we just assume within modern Western world, because the modern Western world largely has a Christian origin, these come specifically from Judeo-Christian values. You're not getting it from Islam. You're not getting it from ancient Roman paganism or European paganism. You're not getting it from Hinduism. You're not getting it from Buddhism. This is specifically predicated on the idea that humanity has self-worth, intrinsic worth, not extrinsic worth.
Well, at the center of this is the uniqueness of Christianity from a cultural perspective. And what I mean by that is, let's look at the three most recognized religions, right? Christianity, Judaism, and Islam. Judaism is also a race, right? Islam does exist now across some different races, but it's highly, highly centered on, say, the Arabic world and near that. Christianity, in part, I think, because of its birth and the timing of its birth, considering the ancient Roman Empire comprised of a lot of different places with different cultures and races, and then the idea spread throughout that empire and then beyond. Christianity doesn't have a race. Christianity represents everything. So when we look at the humanities and let's say more modern history, like especially like, and by modern, I mean like the last 500-600 years, especially where the world is spread and globalized, the New World, America, and the West forms and things like that, you're gonna have such a downstream effect culturally of, say, the Christian church inevitably because it's spread so far and wide across many different, literally racial cultures.
For sure. Yeah, yeah, and it's transcultural in that sense, and
Yes.
this is why you have Korean Christians, and you
Yes.
have Nigerian Christians, and you have French Christians, and you have Indonesian Christians, and Canadian Christians, is because it transcends any one religion or one ethnicity or geographical location, and that was partly confusing to a lot of the ancient world. But like I mentioned to you before, there was this moment early on in Christian history in the book of Acts. They get together and they have to decide, okay, if you believe in Jesus as the Messiah, if you've accepted him as your Lord and Savior, do you need to convert to Judaism? Do you need to both obey certain laws and get circumcised? And they unanimously say no, because that's not what this is about. This is not about just this specific ethnicity. God has chosen people of every tribe, tongue, and nation. And the covenant is, so in ancient Israel, Israel operated as a city on a hill, is how it's often described in the Old Testament, in that they were this example to the nations. We are God's chosen people, and we are going to live a certain way, or we're called to live a certain way. Obviously, they don't do it very well a lot of the time. That's what most of the books of the prophets are about. To be a reflection of God's goodness to the people. In Christianity, it's, okay, now everybody is indwelt with the Holy Spirit. So we are not relegated to a particular area or a temple or a country or an ethnicity. It's beyond that. It's bigger than that. God's mission, which was always the intended mission, transcends those things. Those things that we look at in ancient Judaism are pointing to what is the greater fulfillment. This, in the New Testament, there's a book called the Book of Hebrews. And the Book of Hebrews is all about this, how all of these motifs in the Old Testament are fulfilled and actually we're pointing to Jesus all the way along.
Watching the video, guys. If you haven't already subscribed, please smash that subscribe button and check out this clip's full podcast episode by clicking here